Our first speaker is Jonathon West, formerly from Tasmania, spent 18 years at Harvard, and he returned a few years ago to set up the Australian Innovation Research Centre. And what it says, you'll see in your program, but just to remind you, it says that the purpose of that was rigorous empirical investigation and fresh conceptual approaches. Jonathon now lives overlooking the Freycinet Peninsula in Tasmania, so it was a bit of a struggle to get here, I imagine. Jonathon, welcome.
Thank you. Myths can be very good things. They can give sense to the world. They can give purpose to people. They can give direction and perspective. People will die for a good myth, and frequently have. Myths can also be very bad things. They can distort our perception of reality. They can retard our thinking. They can block our thinking. In my opinion, the myth of innovation, and I'll say in a moment what I think that is, blocks our thinking in this country about what we can do to make innovation work for us. Our policy at a government level and our social thinking about innovation is broken. It doesn't work. And at heart, the reason it doesn't work is because it's dominated by a myth. What is the myth of innovation? The myth of innovation is, put simply, that it arises from creativity. The myth is that innovation arises from creativity. Now, I know that's a very potentially unpopular thing to say at a conference called Creative Innovation. Our typical picture of innovation in this country is of an individual, usually a scientist, usually wearing a white lab coat, working alone, being creative, who discovers something and then says, wow, this is really significant. There must be a market for this. There must be something useful I can do with it. Let me develop it and test it and then see if I can commercialise it, usually through a small company. When we talk about innovation, most people have something like that in mind. A discoverer, tester, commercialisation, foundation of a new company, bringing a new gadget or product to the world. All of our policy is designed to support that kind of process. We support science because embedded in our myth of innovation is that it's about high technology, so we support science. We then support inventors to start companies. We start companies all the time. We have hundreds of them. I think Australia has the highest proportion of small biotech listed companies on its stock exchange per capita in the world. We're terrific at starting, well, they're not really firms, they're sort of firmlets. A few people with a little bank account and a few shareholders listed on the stock exchange. As soon as a company gets to be larger and successful, all government support stops. It literally terminates. And it's very difficult to get support for commercialisation if you're a large company because of our myth. Let me illustrate the myth by talking about the three most important, highest impact innovations of the 20th century. And as soon as I say that, everyone's mind goes to, well, what do I think of the three highest impact, most important innovations of the 20th century? Well, let me say what I think. Now, the first one is obvious. As soon as I say the most high impact innovations of the 20th century, I'm sure at the top of all of your list is the most important one, which is obviously the Haber-Bosch process for the fixing of nitrogen. Now, of course, you've all said that to yourselves, Haber-Bosch process, yeah, that's obvious. But there may be one or two people here who don't know exactly what the Haber-Bosch process for fixing of nitrogen is, and why would some guy stand on stage and say it's the most important innovation of the 20th century? What is it? It's a process for converting energy, particularly gas, into nitrogen. And what is that nitrogen? It's fertiliser. So, what? The most important innovation of the 20th century is a process for creating fertiliser? What the Haber-Bosch process for fixing nitrogen did is it enabled, instead of having 20% of the population supported by 80% of the population working on farms, to have 98% of the population not working on farms and 2% of the population feeding it. The Haber-Bosch process for fixing nitrogen enabled genuine industrialisation, which is one of the transforming events or issues, drives of the 20th century, and it enabled urbanisation. So I don't think there's any doubt in terms of the impact on the human race and how we live that the Haber-Bosch process for fixing nitrogen was the most important innovation of the 20th century. How did it happen? It wasn't done in a university. It wasn't a discovery. The science was well known. What was required was a lot of diligent work over a long time, very routine, quite boring, to develop it as a cost-effective mechanism, and then, and this is the most important part, to build a global system for moving the materials around, for moving the energy, for moving the fertiliser and taking it into the countryside and making it available cheaply to farmers. The construction of that system, social, organisational, logistic system, was the great innovation. Okay, what was the second great innovation of the 20th century? If the Haber-Bosch process changed the way we live, the second great innovation of the 20th century, I think, is undoubtedly the bomb, the atomic bomb. What the atomic bomb did was prevent us from, those of us who live in the developed countries that have access to nuclear weapons, prevented us from fighting each other. It brought an end to war among the great powers. Didn't bring an end to war, as Plato so wonderfully said, only the dead have seen the end of war. We still have war, we still will have war, we always will, but gigantic wars among the great powers were brought to an end by the development of nuclear weapons. How did this happen? It happened as a result of a government program, of a lot of people. The science was well established, had been well established for a long time, but it required a lot of meticulous work, year after year, or at least month after month, with many, many people working in secret to develop it. And then it required the construction of a system to deploy it, and even more importantly, to not deploy it. The most difficult part of introducing the bomb was to develop a system so that it would be available but not used. This is a weapon we cannot use. And so the systems required to make it deployable worldwide but not have it accidentally used are phenomenally complex. Boring, routine, but that's what transformed the second most human activity, most important human activity, warfare. The third most important innovation of the 20th century is even more interesting, and I think that's without doubt containerisation. Containerisation enabled us cost-effectively to move an immense amount of goods around the world. Containerisation enabled globalisation. It wasn't the internet. It isn't communications. what enabled globalisation, what enabled the blizzard of new products, the diversity of foods, of consumer goods that we have, was containerisation. There's no science in it. Believe me, there's very little creativity in a container. It wasn't an individual genius thinking up a new gadget, although it was one person who had the vision. But it's hard to call it a creative vision in the usual sense. What was required to make it happen was a global system. We had to transform the ports, we had to transform the ships, we had to transform the unions, we had to transform all the regulatory systems that control and govern global trade. And when we did that, we enabled the specialisation of nations, and we enabled global trade to explode. If I had 4, I would want an innovation that transformed the only other really important human activity, and therefore I would have to nominate the pill. But I don't have 4, I only have 3. Those 3 transformed the way we live in the 20th century. What they all have in common is not creativity, is not science, is not entrepreneurship, is not the commercialisation of discovery. What they all have in common is the creation of a very large-scale and complex system. And I would argue that almost any important innovation you think about runs into this issue of how do we change the system into which it is plugged. And the reason we do that is we live today, I think the defining characteristic of our era is the phenomenal complexity of the social systems of which we are part. To give you an example, probably the greatest company that's ever existed was the British East India Company. In its time, the British East India Company accounted for over half of all world trade. 2/3 of workers in Britain were employed by the British East India Company at its height. It governed India. At its height, the British East India Company had 10,000 people. Half of all world trade, 2/3 of employment in Britain, government of at the time, the largest, most populous nation on earth, 10,000 people. And if you analyse its organisational structure, we would call it simple, flat. It had relatively few job descriptions, relatively simple division of labour. In today's terms, the East India Company would be a small, not a start-up, but a relatively small, it would not rank as a major global company. Big organisations today have hundreds of thousands of members, tens of thousands of job descriptions, immensely complex interactions. We live in a world of complex organisations and social institutions to a degree that we've never seen before in history. And by complex, we don't just mean that they have many parts, that they have lots of units. We mean that they interact. Those parts interact and they mutually support one another. So that if you change one, you have to change many others. It's usually very difficult with any kind of important innovation just to change one part of the system. Although good systems are designed so you can do that, but they're rare. Usually there's all kinds of connections that you didn't appreciate. Because we live in these complex systems, we live in a world governed by complex regulations, government. The United States, that paradise of cowboy capitalism and deregulated free markets, has one place where it collects all federal regulations. It's called the Federal Register. And if you're a company, you can go and look in the Federal Register and it'll tell you all the rules, regulations, laws that you have to abide by. The Federal Register is 75,000 pages long. And on each page, there's not like one rule, there's a dozen. 75,000 pages long in this paradise of unregulated cowboy capitalism. And the Federal Register grows by an average 6,000 pages a year. 6,000 pages a year. But they're amateurs over there in the US. They're a deregulated society. Over here we've got much more, and in really bureaucratic places they dwarf that. So if you're operating a company today, particularly a large, complex one that touches many parts of the economy, you've got to employ hundreds of people even just to read the Federal Register. 75,000 pages. Even just keeping up with the new stuff, a mere 6,000 pages a year of new regulations, is almost a full-time job. Changing, innovating within such a system is fiendishly difficult, because you will touch so many different parts of that and they will bite you. In my little home state of Tasmania, a friend of mine has a chicken farm, and he wanted to erect a wind generator. He wanted to be able to say on the box for his eggs, carbon neutral. So let's have a wind generator, we'll power our chicken farm with a wind generator. He set down the path to get an approval to put up this wind generator. It's in the countryside, no one lives around him, no one can even see the farm. 42 different approval processes by 17 different agencies were required. And every time he'd get one completed, someone else would show up at the farm and say, oh, by the way, didn't you know you need a permit for not just water, but effluent? That's a different department. And so he would have to go down that track. He said if he'd known at the outset what it would be required to erect one wind generator so he could make his eggs carbon-free, he would never have done it. So the problem we live with is this complexity and the need for system change. And the ultimate problem is that we design our systems to retard innovation. We design them to be robust against change. We design them to be efficient. We design them to be efficient. All innovation is inefficient. There's no such thing as efficient innovation. You have to run experiments. You have to do things that fail. You have to allocate resources to things that don't work. It's inherently inefficient. But we design our systems to be efficient, to not waste resources. And when particularly government systems waste resources, they're condemned. So we live and we attempt to innovate in a paradox. The paradox is that innovation is generally, and when it's at its most important, it's about system change, and yet we design our systems to be so complex and so interrelated and so interdependent that it's almost impossible to change them. And so those people who do, like the inventor of containerization, in my view, while unknown, are the true heroes of innovation. Thank you.